You're listening to episode 81 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Mindfulness teacher Mark Coleman joins us to speak about his book, Make Peace with Your Mind: How Mindfulness and Compassion Can Free You from Your Inner Critic. How many times has that voice inside, that inner critic, spoken louder to you than the people sitting next to you? What does the critic say? And are you curious enough to question whether or not that voice may not always be accurate in its condemnations? My inner critic is pretty loud, shouting at me even when, in my head and heart, I know it's misleading. But it's there, nonetheless, and it's compelling. Bringing mindfulness to that inner dialogue can help illuminate it with your own wisdom and keep the shadows as insubstantial shadows. Mark Coleman is the author of Make Peace with Your Mind and Awake in the Wild. He is the founder of the Mindfulness Institute and has an MA in clinical psychology. Mark has guided students in 5 continents as a corporate consultant, counselor, meditation teacher, and wilderness guide. He lives in Northern California. Special thanks to our friend Kim Corbin for arranging today's interview. Our guest today is Mark Coleman. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Ted. Happy to be here.
Glad to be speaking with you. So let's begin by having you tell us about your background.
So I am English and grew up in Northern England, moved to London, and was a punk rocker, anarchist, student, rebel, angry young man.
It takes me back.
Yeah, it's a little bit quite far back there these days. And was pretty unhappy and had a vicious inner critic and a vicious, angry, hateful side, you could say. And was busy blaming people, parents, society, governments, corporate culture, etc., for my woes, and was really quite hard on myself. And I didn't realize how hard I was until I came across a meditation center somewhat by chance in the East End of London, and was struck as I walked into the center by the presence and groundedness and sparkle people had in their eyes. It was quite striking. And I was really aware that whatever they were doing, those Buddhist practitioners, that there was something going on that I had no idea about, but was very drawn to. So I started meditating, was introduced to mindfulness practice and loving kindness practice. And this was in the mid 80s, and it stuck. It became very transformative. I dropped out of college. I moved into a Buddhist retreat center and really took those practices to heart and really saw how necessary they were for working with my own mind. And what they helped me see was how much my critic was really running my life and ruining my well-being. So stuck with that, and I've been meditating and practicing Buddhist tradition, mostly in the insight meditation tradition for the last 25, 30 years now. And I've been teaching the practices, insight meditation practice, for about 20 years, and moved to the States in the 90s, and both as a therapist and then as a coach and then as a Dharma teacher, have been working with people and seeing how much, not just myself, but how much other people are also plagued by a very critical, judging mind. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, Make Peace with Your Mind, was to help provide some tools from the Dharma tradition, particularly mindfulness and compassion, and how we can really use those mind trainings and heart trainings to free ourselves from the grip of the judging mind.
Let's chat about this inner critic a little bit. Tell us a bit more about what exactly you mean by that. It's perhaps a bit more than how we might commonly think about it.
Yeah, so the inner critic it's a complex set of processes, but basically the judging mind that's oriented towards ourselves, that is attacking basically our goodness and sense of value and worth. So unlike a discerning, discriminating, assessing, evaluating kind of thought, which is all very useful and helpful for navigating the world and choices and decisions and whatnot. The judging mind is, when I talk about the inner critic, it's the pattern of thinking that is always oriented towards what's wrong, what's deficient, what's enough, not enough, what's imperfect. And the net sum of that is that we feel a sense of shame or lack of worth, or there's some kind of internal collapse where we feel deficient and unworthy.
Do you find people sometimes try to silence or ignore that inner voice, and how well does that work for them?
Well, we all develop our different strategies for working with the critic. I think the one I see the most is people rationalizing, trying to get into some kind of hopeless argument with the critic and trying to shore up their sense of worth by trying to convince themselves or the critic that they really are a good person or a nice person or a kind person, or they are really getting their life together honestly at some point. And so as soon as we, what I call, engage with the critic, which means we've both listened to the critic, given it authority, bought into its perspective, then in a way we've already sort of lost the battle, in that we've given this rather distorted, inaccurate perception a reality which it doesn't really have or justify. So I think of course some people try to shut it down or get rid of it, just like trying to get rid of thoughts in meditation. Good luck with that one. But, we want to first bring a sense of mindfulness towards it, a sense of clarity, a sense of understanding it, understanding when and how it's operating, what triggers it, before we can actually, so we're basically cultivating an effective engagement with it rather than trying to get rid of it, because it will have a life of its own.
You brought up something, you used the word discernment before, and in teaching mindfulness, we will sometimes characterize mindfulness as having attributes of being intentional and present moment focused and without judgment about what we're receiving in the current moment. And it's sometimes a difficult concept to wrap our heads around, that, but wait, my judgment that's a good thing. That's how I determine what's true from false, and maybe not how we mean it here. I'm wondering if you could tease out that distinction between judgment and discernment.
Right. So as I mentioned earlier, we definitely not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and we need, in our lives, I hear this a lot from people, in work environments and lawyers and doctors and whoever, who, most of us have to make, a lot of decisions every day, small and large. And we need to be able to discern differences, and, we're assessing ourselves or someone else or a client or a performance, or, a musician assessing their technique. So we're not talking about that kind of judgment. We're talking about the judgment that has a negatively, emotionally laden tone to it, that's oriented around not just the particular action, but the person itself. So we're looking at the judgment that is really oriented towards our sort of fundamental worth and value as a person.
So, what are some other ways one might work with the inner critic other than avoidance or suppression?
Yeah, so, I think the first tool with anything is mindfulness, which is we bring that clarity of awareness. We begin to pay attention to our thoughts and the kind of thoughts. I think it's really important that we learn to isolate the judging thoughts out from all the other kinds of thoughts that we can have, whether they're, as I just said, assessing, evaluating, discriminating. So we're really clear what that voice is. We're clear. We start to look at how it impacts us. One of the shifts for me in my practice was when I was sitting in meditation one day and I was listening to my critic and believing my critic. And then suddenly something shifted and I just started to feel how painful it was to be on the receiving end of all those judgments and rejections and ridicules from the critic. And so once I really let myself feel the pain of that, it's like, oh, this is really, this is really not so helpful and not so useful. And it broke some allegiance to the critic. The critic again didn't go away, but it made me see how toxic it was to really give that voice so much attention. So I think we want to first listen. We want to be aware of it. We want to bring inquiry to it, which is, and I often have students write down their, top 5, 10, 20 judgments and then bring a more discriminating awareness and actually ask, is this true? Is this true that I'm lovable, unlovable, or stupid, or a failure, or whatever the judge is saying to us? And to, examine, and sometimes I'll have people ask, colleagues, friends, loved ones, is this how you see me? Is this an accurate representation? And, for the most part, most people around us would never agree with the sort of absolutist statements coming from our critic. So we want to bring awareness, we want to bring discernment, we want to bring some inquiry. And, as the subtitle of the book suggests, then how mindfulness and compassion can help free you. We also want to bring a heartfulness because, this realm of the inner critic is very painful, as I mentioned. And so we want to also be kind with ourselves. We want to cultivate, this quality of loving kindness, which has a more caring, forgiving attitude, which I think is one of the main practices we can do to counteract the critic, is to learn to build a genuine sense of care and affection and warmth for ourselves and seeing our strengths and goodness rather than our faults and our inadequacies.
It's strange that in loving kindness practice that we often, I certainly do, don't have too much difficulty extending this loving kindness, compassion, care to others. But it's a little harder to direct that inward towards the self. I'm wondering if you run into that with those that you work with, and how do you deal with that when you do?
Yeah, no, I think that's very common. That I think most people are generally quite caring and kind and generous and responsive if there's pain in front of them, and yet when we feeling that same, pain, loss, grief, insecurity, whatever, we can be very harsh and rejecting and abandoning of ourselves. And I think that's really one of the powers of the practice of loving kindness is that we turn towards ourselves and we begin to explore that relationship of how open or closed our heart is, and to, begin to see what's getting in the way, what makes it hard for us to turn to ourselves with care. And I think, what that practice does bring up is the ways that we've rejected ourselves and judged ourselves and pushed ourselves out of our hearts. So, I think one practice that's really important is the practice of forgiveness. There's a chapter in the book called Giving Up All Hope of a Better Past, because the critic, of course, has 20/20 hindsight and can always look back and think all of things you could have, would have, should have done, and all the choices you should have made around money and relationships. And, we all can look back and do that. And we have to actually, accept what is and accept what was, and forgive ourselves for the various things that we've done and said and chosen. And so to begin the path, begin to meet where we are with a loving acceptance rather than scorn.
Yeah, it's interesting that chapter 23 is befriending yourself. You are not your enemy. And how very powerful just that simple awareness might be for those of us who have, however unvoiced it may be, just the sense, that feeling of self as an enemy. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think, I think we have, when we become so aligned with the critic, which many of us are or have been, then we do in a way reject ourselves, and we look through the lens of ourselves as a problem, as a fault, as a lack, as a mistake. And so rather than sensing that everybody's trying to do their best and we're doing what we can and making the choices we do with the resources we have, we instead set up, the critic sets up this impossibly high standard by which we either berate ourselves, or we have what I refer to as the imposter syndrome, where we no longer feel like, we're authentic and genuine, because our critics constantly undermining us with that, pointing out our deficiency all the time.
There's one of the chapters has a concept wrapped into it that is sometimes very difficult to get our heads and especially our hearts around, and that is the strength that may be in understanding and accepting, indeed welcoming, our own vulnerability. And I'm wondering if you could talk for just a moment about opening yourself to that. I know it's one of the exercises you have in the book as well.
Yeah, I think this is really key, both in life and certainly in meditation practice and working with the critic, because, the very reason the critic, the superego, as it's known in psychology, formed was because of vulnerability. We come into this world young, impressionable, dependent on care and affection and love. And, the superego, the critic, develops as a way to shut anything in us down that will cause, scorn or rejection or loss of love from our family and loved ones and culture and religion, etc. So it's important to understand that, whenever we become vulnerable at a later age, that same self-protective mechanism that the critic is part of gets activated. And so the critic tends to get loud when we feel vulnerable. It could be as simple as, we're running late for a meeting, important meeting at work, and maybe our boss is in the meeting, and, underneath the anxiety, we're feeling vulnerable about how we're seen and whether we're valued and are we showing up well and is our boss going to like us. But on the surface, what's going on is the critic's response to that vulnerability is anger and judgment and shaming and punitive demands and whatnot. And that's why we need to integrate within our awareness. We need to also have that inquiry to ask, what's really going on here? Why is the critic gotten all of a sudden riled up? And what is going on underneath that I need to address, which is usually around some issue of identity, of, some sense of ourselves being at risk or a threat. So the more that we can inquire, the more that we can hear the critic, not listen to it and drop down to, oh, I'm feeling scared here. I'm feeling vulnerable around my job or my security or my relationships or my finances or something. And so then we can actually meet that, and it allows the all the words to die down. We can hold, and that's why we need the compassion, because with vulnerability, it's not easy to be vulnerable, not easy to hold it and feel it. And so it takes a certain courage to do that.
Mark, in the years that you've been working with people on these kinds of issues and helping them with just becoming more aware of some of those inner workings, what are some of the common challenges that people have in just becoming more aware?
Well, I think it takes work. It takes practice. It takes, whether it's meditation cushion or putting time to just cultivating that, the muscle of awareness, you could say. I think the other obstacles, one is, simple complacency. We're creatures of the familiarity, and cultivating awareness does require effort, and requires that we have to give up, sometimes habits of dullness or our desire to check out. I think our culture, with its myriad toys of distraction and devices, take us away from ourselves and scatter our attention. Another important area is, when we cultivate awareness, it also means we open to the whole field of our experience. And some of that's beautiful and joyful, but often it's difficult, painful, lonely, anxious, and we'd rather not be with all of that unpleasant experience. And so we go unconscious, check out, think, daydream, numb out using all kinds of substances. So I think, that to wake up and to be present does require that we have to meet all dimensions of our experience, both pleasant and unpleasant, which is not so popular.
In the book, there are many different exercises that you have, and I'm wondering, what are some of your personal favorites?
Well, I'm not sure this is technically an exercise, but one of the practices I recommend cultivating is a sense of humor around the critic, because when we can find a sense of humor, when we can laugh, it usually means that we've got a little space from or around something, with a little more disidentified. And so, and our critic can be quite humorous in an odd way, in that, for example, they can be telling us we should be sleeping more, because sleeping is good for the brain, it's good for our health, and we should be going to bed early and all of that. And then in the morning, it can be telling us we need to be getting fit and healthy and on with our New Year's resolution of, getting to the gym. But we decide to sleep in that morning because the critic thinks that we should be prioritizing sleep. And then when we wake up, it gives us a hard time for missing out on the gym. So sometimes it's just a no-win situation. And so if we can have a sense of humor, I often say to my critics, thank you very much. Thank you. I didn't know that I was late for that appointment. Thank you for your opinion about how I'm a good or bad person in relationship. And so I'll sort of playfully, almost like tease it. So I'm just kind of, acknowledging it, but I'm not letting it land, not letting it, sink its sharp point into me. So I think humor is really important. And then also the inquiry is really important. I talk about, there's many ways to inquire into the critic. And one of the ways I've talked about is Byron Katie's questions of asking, is it true? Can you know that it's true? What's the payoff for listening to the critic telling you you're bad, you're bad, you're bad? Well, the payoff is you feel bad. You feel small, you feel less. And who would you be without that belief? Well, I'd probably feel a lot lighter and happier. So there's a way to skillfully and playfully inquire, I think, is really helpful. And then loving kindness. I think there's nothing more powerful as an antidote to these negative messages than using, since metta in some ways is a cognitive practice, in that we're using words. It's also a heart practice also, and so we're in a way replacing the negative neural pathways of self-judgment with, wishes of kindness and love. And I think that's a very effective antidote, in that it supplants those negative thoughts with much more positive, constructive ones.
Mark, is there anything else you'd like to share with the listeners?
Yeah, I think, the last chapter I talked about life beyond the critic. And I talk about various people I've worked with who've made significant strides to free themselves from the critic, and to know that it is possible to come to understand your critic, to learn how to work with it. And ultimately, we learn how to become somewhat disinterested in its presence or absence. So it's not as if the critic necessarily goes away, although, of course, whenever we stop feeding and believing something, it tends to diminish. But what's more important is that we learn to not be so bothered by it, in the same way that we might not learn to be bothered by noise or by anything else that we may have had reactivity to. We can actually find a sense of spaciousness with mindful awareness and continue to hold ourselves with kindness rather than judgment. So just really want to give your listeners the message that this is really possible, and it's possible to transform this painful tendency.
Well, our guest today, Mark Coleman. If you'd like to hear more about Mark's work, you can go to his website, markcoleman.org. And of course, we'll be linking that on the episode page for this episode, along with his Twitter and Facebook links and a link to his book, Make Peace with Your Mind. Mark, thank you so much for being here.
Great to be with you, Ted. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.